Bible says in Psalms 19 and verse 14, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer." This is just a real brief thought for the week on things that we say, the words that we say. Colossians 4:6 says, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt." All right? And just to dissect and define that a little bit, that grace there is acceptable or gracious in manner. Our speech as a believer, as a Christian, ought to be acceptable. And I know nowadays acceptable in the world is pretty much anything goes, but this is acceptable to God. What we say ought to be acceptable. And then also gracious in manner. It ought to be acceptable to God, and it ought to be gracious in manner. So not just, we think of automatically, we think of, cussing and swearing. Obviously that's wrong. That's not acceptable to God, and that's definitely not gracious in manner. But acceptable to God, also how we say things to people, our words that we use to those around us, whether family members or co-workers or friends or neighbors. Our speech, let your speech be always with grace. Let it be acceptable, and let it be gracious in manner. We get stuck in that trap of, well, that's just how I am. No, our speech ought to be kind to those around us. Be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. And our speech ought to reflect that. So it ought to be with grace, and then also seasoned with salt there means prepared with prudence. Prepared with prudence. Our thoughts, sometimes we ought to give a little thought to our what we say or our speech. Our thoughts ought to be helping us with what we say. And so we ought to prepare with prudence sometimes our answer or what we're going to say. You come into a situation, you see the kids have covered the floor in toys, and you look at that and it's, don't say anything yet. Let your speech be prepared with prudence. Clean up the toys, okay? And so he's saying there, though, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. Then I want to also toss in there Titus chapter 2 and verse number 8. It says, sound speech that cannot be condemned. That word sound there is healthy and true in doctrine. Healthy and true in doctrine, all right? We want it to be healthy and very true in our doctrine or in our teaching. If gracious and prepared with prudence, what we say can be healthy for a sick soul, and there's a lot of sick souls out there that are in need of some gracious, prepared with prudence, sound speech. Boy, there's a lot of people that could use that nowadays. There's a lot of discouraged out there, and we could encourage a lot of people by our speech, by it being gracious, by it being prepared, maybe thought out a little bit before we, you've heard people say, bite your tongue, and maybe what we ought to do, not necessarily bite our tongues, but hold off on what we say, think it through, prepare it with prudence, and then make sure that it is sound speech. Because that soul that may have lashed out at you may be a sick soul and needing someone with some seasoned, gracious speech. Just a thought of the week. Hopefully that's a blessing to you all. God bless.